I'm going to spend a couple of minutes going over some of the different performance counters that are important for you to consider when you're measuring your application. One of the first ones is the processor counter. This simply measures how much your CPU is being used as part of this testing process. Another important one is under the process category. You can determine the percentage processor time for a specific process. This can be useful to determine the testing overhead or to measure specific parts of your application and see what impact each one has on the total CPU load. The next important category is memory. There are a number of different memory counters, and you can see some of them here. These are the most important ones to track if you're trying to see if memory is causing a constraint or a bottleneck for your application under load. You may also wish to measure the disk and network usage of your application. For these, the physical disk percent idle time and the network interface output queue length are both useful counters to have a look at. If you're using a web application, there are a number of ASP.NET counters that you'll want to look at. Most of these should be kept at 0, the exception being the requests current, which should be small but is something that will typically rise as you add additional virtual users, and requests per second, which is generally something that you're trying to maximize. So as you add additional load, requests per second should continue to rise. If at some point it peaks and you continue to add users while requests per second does not increase, that means you've pretty much hit the limit of what your application is able to do with its current setting in terms of maximum requests per second for that user load. If you're using a database, there are a number of different counters you'll want to look at. The most important one, I think, is the batch requests per second. You want to minimize how many database requests per second you have per the number of web page requests or application requests that you're implementing. That is, if you are able to sustain 10 pages per second, you shouldn't have, at that point, 100 batch requests per second if you can avoid it. It's better to minimize the number of SQL batch requests you have per page in a web-based application. You'll also want to consider some measurements on the SQL Server machine itself, such as its CPU, memory, and disk. Finally, another couple of counters you may wish to look at include the .NET CLR JIT percentage. You want to minimize this if at all possible, as well as the locks and threads counters, contention rate per second, and current queue length, both of which should be kept to a minimum as well.